good. It's green. It's green.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Leaders Angle of the Stellenbosch Business School. I think it's the first time we've done it in Stellenbosch, in the town, and very grateful to Stias for welcoming us here today. The business school is normally based in Cape Town, as many of you know, but as part of our role in Cape Town, in Stellenbosch, in the Western Cape, we see ourselves much more than the school, much more in a place than where people go and do their MBA or do their PG dip in business, whatever particular discipline you might be interested in. It's about a school that's in service of wider society, a school that's part of the community and part of the ecosystem, serving the ecosystem. And that we do that obviously in our education, in the work that we do, in the research that we do, in our engagement with different stakeholders. But I think it's also important that for an institution of higher education that spans civil society, business, not-for-profits, government, policymakers, we have a role as a convening space, a space that can bring together individuals and stakeholders to discuss some of the challenging issues of the day. And I think most of us would agree that South Africa needs a space where we can have those conversations, we can have those discussions in a safe space, but also a challenging space and a frank space. And we've not been scared or to shy away from doing that in the business school. When the Campepe report came out at the end of last year, we hosted the Leaders Angle where we took on the topic head on. We've also done topics around the budget and around national healing, bringing together different experts both from inside the school and outside the school. And I think we're proud of that, and we really see our role in terms of service to wider society in doing that. One of the levers in which enables us to do that is in the centres and research expertise that we host in the business school. We have expertise in futures and foresight, in development finance, in responsible leadership, and also in conflict and collaboration. And that brings me to our host, if I can call him that, Brian Ganson today, who's a professor at the business school, and in a way captures that sort of atypical role that you that I'm trying to underline of the business school. But we wouldn't maybe traditionally find somebody like Brian in a more conventional notion of the business school as a political scientist, somebody that works as a lawyer, somebody who works in conflict spaces across the continent, somebody who brings together an engagement in qualitative methodologies, but also cutting-edge methodologies in terms of machine learning with collaborators from around the world. So that tries to capture the role that we have as a business school, the expertise that we bring together, and also the pulling power we have to convene important national, international debates like today. So I'm very happy to hand over to Brian, who's going to host the event for you this morning and engage with our panelists. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, and welcome both to the people in the room and also to our viewers on the Stellenbosch YouTube channel. We're super glad you're all with us. My main job is to stay out of the way of some amazing guests here this morning. So I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks. I'm going to dispense in the wonderful South African spirit of all protocols observed with any formal introductions and let our speakers speak. Our starting point for today's conversation is that for many of us, the current situation in South Africa is feeling more and more like the 1980s. Growing social division, high levels of tension and violence. We've heard claims recently of terrorism in the electric industry and elsewhere, and even calls for a state of emergency. Murray Hoffmeyer was chairman of the consultative business movement. He warned us in 1990 at the time of the democratic transition that the political transformation which is about to take place will not be successful unless it is accompanied by an equivalent transformation of the economy. We already knew back then that the political transformation and the economic transformation needed to move hand in hand. And yet, undoubtedly, the situation of the majority in South Africa has not changed commensurately with the promises of that new constitution. The calendar told us that it was Freedom Day last Thursday and Workers' Day yesterday, and yet the question is on all of our minds. Is there still room to navigate an economic transition without ever increasing destructive conflict and violence? And if so, how are we going to achieve that? And so what I'm going to do is kick off with our wonderful panelists, ask some initial questions, and then move to our audience both on YouTube and here in the room as quickly as I can manage. Dr. Nchake, I'm going to start with you if that's all right. You're an economist here on the faculty of Stellenbosch University. So I just want to start with the facts, right? Where are we? Where do South Africans find themselves today in terms of ability to work, to earn a living wage, to accumulate assets, in terms of our ability to educate our children and build a better future, in terms of healthcare, food security, other necessities of life? You know, the perception is that many are still left out and left behind. Is that true?
Thank you very much. And I would like just to sort of say this, that we are past 3 decades post 1994. And I think the hope of many South Africans was that we'll see a large transformation in terms of where we were and where we are, in terms of changing the pre-apartheid era policies that actually segmented the population, in terms of showing these stark differences that led to inequality that we observe today. And I'll start saying that because these inequalities are the source of many people being left behind, as you put it. We see social inequalities, we see economic inequalities, gender inequality, and racial inequalities that actually characterize how the society is segmented today. And this is observed in the education sector, where you see the differences in terms of public education and private education. And public education still is characterized by low quality compared to the private education, although it is affordable to many parts of the population. It is not as good as the private education. And this already sort of it's already make a path for many of them to actually be not be able to be employable in many skilled sectors. So the health sector similarly is characterized by these large inequalities. We have the private sector, we have the public sector, and the private sector is inaccessible to many South Africans, especially the poor and the middle income population. And the public health sector although it's accessible, you'll find that the quality is also not as good as the private health sector. And this already determine the kind of health status of many of the population. So it just brings the question of then is this kind of part of population going to be able to be productive at work? And it links to the question of the ability to achieve upward mobility. If you are not going to get a good quality education and you are already disadvantaged in terms of access to good quality health care, are you going to be able to penetrate the skills sector? Are you going to be able to be productive even if you get employment? And in terms of ability to work, the level of education, skills, and experience determine this this ability to work and learn a decent living wage. We talk about decent living wage, not really just living wage, because many of South Africans, you find that one is a breadwinner and they need to feed a family of more than 7 members of the household, and that requires a decent living wage. And if you cannot even afford a basic necessities, are you going to be able to afford to accumulate assets? And this is important in the era of COVID-19, where we see the cost of living rising significantly for many South Africans, especially not only the poor, but also the middle income earners. Many cannot afford the basket of commodities that they could afford before. So this puts even the majority of the population even below the basket, the minimum basket necessities of goods and services. It becomes, you see many selling their houses because they can't afford the interest rate. Interest rate is rising, trying to capture rising inflation, trying to lower spending, but you see this affecting more the poor than those who can afford. And the middle income are also becoming to be affected in a similar way. You also asked me about the issue of food security. This links directly to agriculture and the ability of the country to produce for food security, but also to export commodities to earn foreign income. This, given the recent changes in climate, affected also. And you know the majority of the poor and those in rural areas are employed in the agricultural sector. And they can also be able to produce for consumption and also for selling the produce. And I would also want to touch on the issue of women and their role in actually feeding the families and also earning income to take the kids to school. Because evidence shows that women are able to actually to earn income and also feed the families than men. That is evidence. As an economist, I rely on data. So if women are not able to access good education or even good health, they are not going to be able to work and they are not going to be able to feed their families. And this actually worsens the situation that we're already in. So in summary, that's what I would say. So another point that I want to close with is access to basic necessities. I think it is evident across that many South Africans, especially the poor, I'm concentrating on the poor because there are those who are left behind. They cannot access good quality basic necessities, sanitation, water, utilities. And I think when we come to talk about an issue of electricity, even the whole population is affected given the current, the recent power cuts. So the ability to access basic necessities is not only determined by the ability to earn good wage, but also the policies that the government puts in place in order to provide it and to make this accessible and as inclusive as possible. So it is not only now the issue of Education, health, as I've mentioned before, it's also about the government policies and regulatory systems that needs to be actually strengthened to be able to enable many of the South Africans to have access to these basic necessities, because they also still link back to the ability to work. If you cannot access basic necessities or good quality basic necessities, then it also affects your ability to work, ability to earn wages and a decent life. Thank you very much.
Wow, and thank you so much for that sobering introduction. Jay, I'm going to turn to you because I think it leads very much from this last point, that it's not only the situation of individuals, but actually the structure of our economy and the choices we've made as a society that are enabling and perpetuating the levels of poverty and sometimes despair we're seeing. And you grew up in the struggle, you lost friends in the struggle, you led CUSATO, you were part of the constitutional negotiations, you were a minister in Mandela's first cabinet. I can't imagine that the South Africa we see today is the South Africa that you fought for. And so I ask you to reflect for us what happened. And in particular, if you, under an admittedly much more hostile government, were able to be part of coalitions that brought about change, do you have any perspectives on why we are not seeing those kinds of effective coalitions emerge today? So a little self-reflection on where we took a bad turn and on why we're not doing more about it.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the first place we should start is what was the mission of the Mandela generation, which in a sense I'm part of. And the intention was always crystallized in a very simple one sentence. We are fighting for one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. So if you look at the arc of the evolution of democracy, I would say by 1994, that generation delivered that. A constitutional container within which the heart of the Constitution spoke about addressing the legacy of the past, of apartheid, exclusion, and racism that was institutionalized across every sector of our society. And so that was the mission achieved of the Mandela generation. And I know today there are some fingers pointing at, did that original sin begin with the negotiation? And I think that's misplaced. Because if we have not done anything since that, then we should take responsibility for this. And that's why people in power, whether you're in this university, or you're in politics, or you're in business or labor, you must take responsibility for the mess this country is. It had nothing to do with the negotiations, because we had power in our hands. The second thing is that we deracialized politics. We did. You know, you can see that at every level of society. But did that translate into the economic transformation and deracialization? And there, the answer is a big no. And then we have to ask ourselves, why? And again, you know, I think people have this idea that the anti-apartheid movement, the democratic movement, was some monolithic, homogeneous organization. Well, what you see today had its seeds planted long time ago. The divisions, the factionalization, and even, you know, the transformation which was led by the ANC didn't mean that, that we were all on the same page. Well, we assumed we were on the same page. And so if you look at the different strands in the political analysis of the movement that led the liberation struggle, well, there were people in exile, and those people felt they were the government in exile. Only thing they could come in Pretoria marching on tanks waving ANC flags. So we had a negotiation. It was a political negotiation. There were those that were in prison. They also believed that they were the natural inheritors of the political governance of this country. And you had people like us, trade unionists and women and activists of the mass struggle. And all of those merged, because within the great tent of the liberation movement, you had communists and you had nationalists and you had capitalists and you had every different spectrum of political affiliation or commitment. So we go into government and be united by one thing, that we have to deliver something fundamentally different. And that was led by the union movement. And the union movement put forward a notion of a reconstruction pact. That it's all great to say, and this is in the late 80s, at the time when they were bombing our buildings and killing our activists, and just prior to Mandela being released. And we had a notion that while we're all united fighting for democracy, how do we define the content of that democracy? And it led to an earlier statement you made, we have to transform both the political and material lives of people. That's the content of the better life we want to deliver people. And so the idea there was precisely about how do we ensure that people who have been marginalized and excluded, which was the black majority, because that's what wealth was and exclusion was, would be entitled to own assets, whatever those assets are. And those were negotiations that had started in that period, looking at the transformation of education, training, and health, and particularly negotiations on the factory floor about what does this mean for you in this factory? Or what would it mean for you as a farm worker working on a farm? And that was the intention of the transformation strategy that I was part of, And that's why we developed the notion of the Reconstruction and Development Pact, which then became a program, a bit watered down, because we were negotiating between a tripartite alliance. But I think it represented a social consensus. And if you want to make progress in society, there has to be social consensus. And so the social consensus was that, yes, we will transform this country, we will meet the basic needs of people, and we will create pathways of opportunity that will give people hope, whether it's through education, through better health facility, whether the government would create the ability to ensure the transformation of the lives of all our citizens. That never happened. Never happened because our intention of transformation got overtaken by a strategy of transformation led by big business. And now we sit in Stellenbosch, the citadel of white wealth. And that's our reality today, that we are going back to the 80s. If you look at the stridency of the debates that we have, you look at the festering wound that exists in this country, it's not going to take too much for there to be a complete upheaval of the society, and legitimately so. Because if I was young, sitting in the informal settlements that come from here, I would be angry. But unfortunately today, the anger, a lot of it doesn't have a political content like it had in our day. So yes, the transformation and the resulting black economic program was not led by the unions. It was never our idea that we'll have a sprinkling of politically connected people that will get enormously wealthy, and the vast majority will be left still in the cesspool of poverty and inequality. And today, while we've been the pariah of racism in the past, we're today the pariah in the world of inequality. And it coincides with the color of your skin. So I say, there's not been an economic transformation. So now we can point fingers. Of course, you can point a finger at government. They should take responsibility and be held accountable to it. But what about the position of those that have privilege? What about white corporate world in this country? So we're not unique in that, because this has now become a general theme across the world, and particularly in the pandemic response, which concentrated wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So while in South Africa, we had 2 million people losing their jobs and thousands of businesses closing down, the 1% in the world has made $5 trillion. They've grown richer. I was reading an article yesterday that there were 40 billionaires who made money out of the pandemic. Now, we are close to what I call systems collapse globally, because young people completely distrust politicians, business, trade union leaders, civil society, many of them being compromised. So the compromising is not just at the political level. And if one looks at this, I think that we are actually born for this moment. I'm really excited, because what happens when things break down, like they broke down towards the end of the 80s, there's going to be the rise of something new. So we're going through the birth pangs, and the more we hang on to what we have, whether that's old ideologies or whether that's the way we saw life in the past, whether it's sitting in these buildings and thinking we're getting educated when we're actually getting brainwashed, where we get trained for jobs that will not exist because the technological revolution has completely disrupted. And when you look at where artificial intelligence is going, where you look at nanotechnology, you look at 5D printing, the world has changed. If you start looking at the consequence of the pandemic, I mean, we even have been robbed of the sovereignty over our own bodies, and we're not even raising questions about that. You've been told what to do. So I think we're in a very interesting moment where I expect that the systems will collapse, like ESCOM is collapsing. And maybe that's a good thing, because then we have to confront the reality of who we are, where do we come from, what is the content of our definition of being South African. Can I continue to live in this affluence when every day I pass people living in absolute poverty? And unless that happens, we're not going to have the leadership that is prepared to make the sacrifices that the Mandela generation made. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Dr. Eloff, I'm going to turn to you to focus for a moment particularly on the business community in South Africa. And I know that's not fair, because business in South Africa is diverse. It's small traders and small producers. It's also white monopoly capital. And but where I'd like you to reflect is, you know, the story that is told about the consultative business movement in the late 80s and into the 90s internationally is often that, oh, look at how business is forward-looking and can help bring about change. And in fact, as I dug into the history with you and with others, it turns out that the consultative business movement was in fact a reaction to the intransigence of business. It was business leaders who realized that they needed to step out of the comfort zone of their colleagues, take a stand for something different from what the majority of business leaders of the day were doing. And so if you could reflect for us, when you look at business today, when you look at perhaps intransigence in the broader business community. Are there lessons that have been forgotten? Are there dynamics that worry you in what you're seeing?
Thanks, Brian. If I may, just before I answer that question, just add to what Jay said.
Super.
And I think if we asked everyone in the room what went wrong, we'll probably get 25 different views. But if I can list, without going into them, just 5 issues I think that helped the issue, the place where we are today, or caused it. I think if we look back, whether we white or black, we underestimated the complicatedness of running a democracy in a globalized world. Remember, apartheid never had to contend with globalization. The ANC had to. And we often forget that. Secondly, together with that, we lost experience and expertise. Not that the people who came in didn't have it, but we lost too many who had it, and we got rid of them too quickly. I think that the ANC's ambivalence on economic policy, I'm sure Jay would agree with me, also had something to do with it, because the difficult decisions were never taken, and when Thabo Mbeki took some difficult decisions, he was ousted by Jacob Zuma. Fourthly, the education system has failed, like you said, and it's still failing. And I'm talking here mainly about the basic education system and the training system. Universities are hanging on there. I must also say that while I'm on this campus. And then a final one, just to say that, and I think this is often overlooked or ignored by ANC members specifically, or people from the recent struggle, and that is there was an old saying of SAA that said, we didn't invent flying, we just perfected it. Now, Zuma didn't invent corruption and cadre deployment. It was there, but he perfected it. And I think the toxic mixture of cadre deployment and black economic empowerment gone wrong, as Jay said. Not broad-based. It was high-level based. It should be HBBE. So just to add that. But Jay and I know each other from way back. We were together in the peace process and negotiations, and it's nice to see that there's still some of the fire of a trade unionists there. Back to your question on business. Business people are simple people. They see an opportunity, they're entrepreneurs, they say, I can put some energy in, I can produce a product, I use other people's money for that, I need shareholders, and then I make a profit. And in the end, I also produce something for society to consume that they need. So I also do something good. So business today and in the late 80s didn't want to become involved in politics. I remember Mike Rosholt, who was then the chairman of Barlow Rand, one of the big conglomerates, always used to say the business of business is business, not politics. And when a group of business leaders realized, but this is, we are bound to lose our businesses. We're bound to lose the economy if there's a full-scale war. They said, well, perhaps we should change that by saying the business of business is to stay in business and do and help whatever you can to make sure that happens. So the business community, under the leadership of those, and it was 40 individuals, they were not even representing their companies. Their companies sort of knew about it, but they didn't want to say, I'm here for Anglo American or for Sanlam, whatever. But so they went from ignorance and animosity towards the trade unions and towards politics to an understanding that unless we play a role here, we lose everything, and the country will lose everything. And so I always say we went from ignorance and animosity to enlightened self-interest. Now people say, but business must be morally correct. And that's true. But if you're only driven by morality, if the troubles come in the front door, morality walks out the back door. And as an ex-Dominee or Minister of Religion, I don't like that, but that's human nature. So it's a much better driving force to be driven by enlightened self-interest. And enlightened then is to understand that I must also work with others for the sake of the country. The interest remains. I can only be a business person if I make a profit. Otherwise, I can't employ people, I can't make a living. And so it moved to enlightened self-interest, and Jay will remember that on the other side, business on the one side, there wasn't always a recognition of this. We were ideologically quite far apart. Long story short, business, I did think, played a role in the peace process, and we spoke this morning. If the peace process and the signing of the peace accord had not happened in 1991, we wouldn't even be sitting here. We would have a ravaged country from which we hadn't even been able to come back from. But the politicians don't like to talk about the peace process, and you won't read it in any books in politics, because people who write about politics interview politicians. And politicians tell their story, and their story is not that of the peace process because they weren't in charge. It was a collective effort by politicians, but also business and the unions and the churches and the rest of civil society. So what happened after, so Brian, let me not be too long, but I think business realized there's something like a political economy. You can't just have an economy. Economy has political consequences, and the other way around. And so the CBM and business became more involved. There was a business election fund before the 1994 election. After the election, under the just at the end of the Mandela reign, with the start of the Mbeki reign, we started a thing called the Big Business Working Group, in which the president and his cabinet, twice a year at least, met with big businesses, and they had a relationship. You know, Tawu could pick up the phone and call a businessman and say, "What do we do here?" Zuma killed all that. We also, in 1999, from business side, formed the Business Trust. And the Business Trust was formed as a partnership between a group of business leaders and cabinet on government's priorities. I remember we said we would raise 1 billion rand from business. Now, 1 billion rand today, you know, everyone has 1 billion rand. You know, if you're a little bit involved with Zuma, you have 1 billion rand. But in 1999, 1 billion rand was a lot of money. I mean, I would estimate it's about 15 billion rand today. And business said, we'll raise it because we want to make a contribution. And so the government said, okay, give us the money. And we said, no ways. We will do it with you on your priorities. And so the Business Trust identified two priorities. The one was job creation, and we choose the tourism sector. And I still believe today that our tourism sector has grown and has become so strong because of that input. It was a 500 million rand input over 2 years. And we chose education. And we had 1,000 schools in which we ran programs in English and maths. And unfortunately, I must say today, and I spoke to someone who was involved in that you can't see those schools today. Because when a system is broken, out of 25,000 schools, if you take 1,000 schools, they can't survive in the system. The system will kill them. Okay, where are we today? I think when Zuma came, all ties with business were cut, and the business community felt alienated, and they went on their own. And one can talk about whether they obstructed the aims of the RDP or whether both government and business had a role to play there. Today, I think business has realized, well, let me first say when Cyril Ramaphosa came in, they thought, well, anything after Zuma, firstly, and secondly, here's a guy who should understand business. He's a businessman himself, but it didn't happen. For many reasons. You know, I think we should go to the political department and we'll talk about that. The point is business then kept helping. And what happened is that Business Unity South Africa, which tries to combine all the business organizations and business leadership South Africa, worked very hard with government. I mean, most of the presidential projects in the presidency are funded by business as we speak. But they don't get anything back from it. There's no policy changes. There's no transparency. And obviously now, as Jay said, the system is crippled. So it's not just, change the policy and everything will happen. It's, do you get a visa? I mean, you know how long the head of the business school waited for a visa. 18 months. I mean, our system is broken. The whole governmental estate is broken. And you can see it best at local level. Some at the top, like Treasury and others, are still fine. But we have an incapable state. We have an incompetent state. And so, Jay is right. It is breaking down. And perhaps it's a good thing that something else can come in his way. So I would say business today are as frustrated as they were in the 80s. They worried to put their head above the parapet because they worried that they will be called racists, especially if they're white, although there are many black business people who feel the same. It was easier morally to stand up against apartheid. It's more difficult today for business to criticize government because you can easily be seen as a racist. But it's coming. It is there. And I think it should be there. And I think business should, again, play a role as they in the peace process, together with the unions, together with the churches, to form, I would almost say, a check upon politicians, all politicians. When many people say the ANC will fall under 50%, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. The point is not that. The point is, if they fall under 50%, what do we get? Are we happy that there are some opposition parties that will do the things that we want to do? I don't know. But perhaps civil society in business and unions must start playing that role again for the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that. At the risk of arguing with my friend and panelist, right, I'd reflect that what we also see is businesses that are willing to take advantage of the lack of government capacity. Here in the Western Cape, we have an agricultural industry that is addicted to substandard wages. We've heard no commitment from business to actually guarantee a dignified living wage for the workers. We have the head of a major mining house calling for the deployment of the army to manage social issues that his company was a big part of creating. And yet, in that, and this is my transition to you, Masego, is some of you have found a way, and I'm just so impressed by how you have taken your personal history and turned that into an investment of a different kind of business in South Africa, one that is intentionally developmental, viable as a business and viable for your employees, for your other stakeholders. And so I was hoping you could reflect a little bit with us about both what it takes to make that work, to have an integrated business approach to economic transformation, but also what's standing in the way. This is not to diminish your efforts or the efforts of your counterparts, whom we find all over the country, but I think it's fair to say that the kind of enterprises you are building are still the exception and not the rule in this country. And so maybe help us to understand, if we wanted developmental business organizations, to reach millions of people, what would we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think first and foremost, I do believe that as civil society, we have a responsibility to play in building our country and our economy. It's not, only the government's responsibility for policy to be implemented. And I think for me, having studied abroad, lived abroad, I've always been excited about the idea of coming back to South Africa and being part of building whatever that looked like, right? And being part of those conversations. And I think coming from a rural area, my family is from Northwest Province. Growing up, I was in Buputatswana, which was a former homeland. But it's interesting because I'm from a farming family as well, so things were very productive. There were, I guess, entities in place that were supportive of development, especially in agriculture, especially financing, right? And I think the contrast now, I think for me, seeing those structures falling apart and farmers struggling to access finance and security and all of that. So I think it's so important that we understand the complexities of rural areas, because I think most of the time, with all the great policies that are in place, there's a huge disconnect with what is going on the ground and what the national government wants to implement. So for me, it was very important to spend time on the ground understanding what are the challenges. I remember after finishing matric, I actually took a year off and I worked. And the idea was for me to make enough money so that I could go and identify a rural school out in the outskirts of Mafeking to work as a teacher, like a volunteer grade 1 teacher. And I'm glad that they allowed me to do that. But for me, that was like a pivotal time in understanding the complexities, because I think as an outsider's perspective or from a researcher's perspective, it's easy to point a finger on government. Oh, the rural schools are failing because government is not doing this. The problems are much deeper than that. And I would encourage every South African to spend time in rural areas. If you've not been to a rural area, take a week off, and spend time there, because you'll realize just how complex. And I love what Jay said about the effects even of some of these policies, even from apartheid, right? Because remember, a lot of these homelands were dumping sites for unskilled labor. Even post-1994, that's not going to change overnight, A lot still needs to be done, and I think for me personally, that's been the motivation for the work that I'm doing. Because education, like you said, plays a big role in development, and seeing the state of education, my husband and I started an orphan charity called Raise the Children, and we identify orphans from rural, remote areas. And South Africa has more than 5 million orphans in our system, and in this country, if you're an orphan, it's really hard for you to see, like the next day, pretty much. And so we place our orphans in high-performing private schools, because if you're going to develop rural areas, you need a skilled workforce. You need to invest in education, in high-quality education, right? So as a short-term solution, obviously, you're not able to, overhaul the whole education system. These are some of the measures, even as individuals, that we can do. And so some of our orphans, go to universities, different universities across the country. We make sure that they're employable. We also challenge them to think innovatively and differently about creating opportunities. So seeing those challenges in their villages, whether it's lack of adequate healthcare, as an opportunity for business, right? Because I personally see business as a catalyst for social impact in our country. And I think for government, from a government perspective, government's role is to create a conducive environment for businesses to thrive, right? Making sure that we scrape out red tapes, to make sure that we support businesses by providing infrastructure. I've built a factory in the Northwest Province. A lot of my businesses are based in rural areas, and I can tell you, it's frustrating sometimes, even just dealing with inefficient municipality, water not working, from time to time, dealing with electricity cuts. If I run a factory, my goal as a business is to be profitable. I would like to create jobs, but at the end of the day, I need to figure out what works for me, right? Whether I'm making an income or I'm not making an income, and that will determine whether I shut the factory or not. But I think it's so difficult in our present economy to sort of like still retain jobs while you feel like you're also not being supported by government. And I think also the role of business is to create jobs, is to drive innovation. If you look at economies like America, the American government is really driven by businesses like small businesses. And so I think to your question, some of the things that are in place, that are standing in the way. One is, governance issues that I mentioned. Jay also mentioned lack of trust from both local citizens and investors. I think sometimes when we see people protesting, especially in townships, it's because of frustration. People are tired. It is not nice when you wake up and your trash is not picked up, or you don't have water, And so I think this is the only way people are trying to get the message across. And also from an investor's perspective, it's difficult for me to invest in entrepreneurs in a township or in rural areas where I know that there's a lot of risk associated in terms of like maybe the business not being able to make profit because of things that they have no control over, like electricity and all of that. So that is destructive in of itself. I mentioned, lack of adequate service delivery from municipalities. The role of municipalities obviously is to provide soft, soft and hard like infrastructure as well. So if that is not guaranteed, that becomes problematic. And I'd also like to talk about, leadership crisis in these municipalities. When you don't have skilled people running engineering and other departments in municipalities, it's difficult for us to expect certain outcomes. A lot of our municipalities, especially in rural areas, get grants from local governments, right? It's not like they get money from levies and property taxes and all of that. A lot of it's grants, but I keep asking myself if we're just putting money in the same problem without really holding people accountable for results. Right? And maybe we need a renewed vision. Like we need to think about where we are as a country, particularly in rural areas, because my heart is really drawn to rural areas because that's where the problem comes. And that's why we will continue to see migration. I hear I'm not from Cape Town, but I hear Cape Town people saying, we have a lot of people from the Eastern Cape. They will keep coming, It's not going to change. So why don't we actually start from the bottom where the root is, figuring out what is the issue, right? So because if the municipalities keep employing incompetent people, things are not going to change. And so how do we hold our leaders accountable? And then we ensure that they deliver on their mandate as well. And that's what we're asking for as business. We know what we need to do. Our focus is on building sustainable businesses. On my side, I've invested in agriculture as well. I train beekeepers, and our whole focus is to export honey overseas because there's a huge demand, right? You were talking about earning foreign income. I'm also in the wine industry, right? There's huge demand for South African products like overseas. And that was also my motivation for doing what I'm doing with business, right? That I lived overseas. I lived in New York. I lived in London. It was hard for me to find South African products on the shelf. So what needs to be done in rural areas in order for us to make sure that we increase productivity, right? And so as an employer, I need the confidence of having, knowing that my workforce is skilled, right? And it's the responsibility of government to ensure that, right? We're not asking for much. So it is complex. And I would encourage people to, continue building. It's really hard. I will not lie. There are days where you just feel like throwing in the towel and just building elsewhere. But it's our country, and we all need each other. Black, white, Indian, yellow, it doesn't matter. And business has a powerful role because we are the job creators.
Thank you so much. What I really appreciate in the panel, and this is just a reflection before we turn to questions, is this willingness to look at ourselves and not just point the finger at government. Obviously, government policies and capacities are incredibly important to any economic transformation, but as Jay said, it's also about what are the labor unions doing or not doing, what is civil society doing or not doing, what are business leaders not or not doing. You framed it as what are we doing to hold government accountable, because if we don't change what we're doing, they're not going to change what they're doing. And I think that's an important takeaway. I'm going to ask her a couple of questions, and let's start with a couple of questions from our under 30s in the room. So I'm going to ask you to be honest, but let's hear a couple of younger voices first, if anybody has a question for a panelist in particular or the panel in general. There we go. Thank you for kicking us off. That's always a hard role to play. Just your name and your question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Queen Machikijela, and I am the Treasurer General of the SRC at Stellenbosch University.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is to Mr. Naidu. Do you think that because our leaders have many side hustles, which our generation would call it side hustles, that they seem to forget to execute their constitutional duties, hence why we see the problems that we're facing in our country right now?
Well, that is one important reason, but not the exclusive reason. I mean, it was best characterized by an eminent ANC leader that said, "I did not struggle to be poor." Mm. And that says it all, you know. Oof. And I don't think that's anything different in any political party anywhere in the world. Politicians have discovered that politics is more profitable than a hard slog at building businesses, you know, because you're in charge of the cookie jar. So I think the first thing we want to do is understand how we got democracy. It wasn't that Mandela descended from heaven and unleashed a magic wand that won us our freedom. Our freedom was won because we stood up. People in the rural villages, the farm workers, the factory workers, the intellectuals, and then including business people that we weaned off a diet of institutionalized racism to make profit. And so we were able to create a momentum of society and then build a societal context. So what Tiens is talking about, those were the idea of coming into a room, even in building union unity. You know, let me just say, we were never, you know, it was as conflictual as what you will see today in politics, you know. So every constituency was divided with a spectrum of opinions or ideologies. And so out of that brokenness and division and factionalism, we found leadership that was able to rise above their vested interests. And so this is the critical point at which you're able to transition, is how does one find a common ground in the face of the reality of deep divisions in your society. That requires leaders of extraordinary courage and capability, but driven by a very moral center that I'm here to serve, and therefore I have to improve. So that was a quality of leadership that took us away from a low-scale civil war that would have destroyed not just infrastructure, but killed a lot of people. And if you look at the international statistics on countries that are fragile and failed, well, that end up in a situation of deep conflict, which is civil war, it takes them about, on average, it's a lifetime, 25 years, to recover to what they were, not understanding you've lost a lot of ground. So we didn't want that. So we chose a political transition where, remember, and sometimes memory is a very important thing because people think they know history, but we don't study history today. You know, that we were at a point where the world expected a racial civil war in this country. And the the protagonist in the battle was, of course, the National Party on one side and the ANC on the other side. The National Party's initial proposition in the negotiations was we want to give white people a right to veto over any democracy. That's where the starting point was. But we ended up at a point where we all were able to rise above our constituency, swim against the popular current, and arrive at a point where we created the democracy that we have today, that is representative, where each person has an equal vote. So I'm saying that we seem to have forgotten that. And I think if I identify 3 critical mistakes. One, we went into government, and I'm part of that, in the idea that the state should deliver its responsibility. It discharges responsibilities by creating jobs, building clinics, a long wishing list of proposals that we had. And then we inherited a state that was essentially bankrupt and also incompetent, because it had no idea of how to deliver beyond a smaller constituency. And then we made that even more complex by issues like cadre development, where we deployed people not based on competency. In the initial period, there was competency, but increasingly it morphs into which faction are you part of. So I chaired the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and I knew every time we had a local government election, 1 year before, there was nothing happening in local government. And when a new person came in, the first thing they did is fire everyone and appoint their own people. So another year was wasted. So at every 5-year cycle, you're wasting 2 years. Now, you cannot run a business on that basis. You cannot run a country on that basis. So I think that, if I have to ask myself today, what is the debate we should be having that we're not having? First of all, the focus on jobs is wrong. There's no ways. No company, no government anywhere in the world can go and create jobs, because jobs are out. The idea is, what are the pathway to livelihoods? What is the livelihoods? Now, at one point in 2013, I was part of a group that bought a farm on which there were 150 people squatting in the Free State. And we deliberately bought it, because we want to see what is transformation. And that's where I know the detail of how we're failing. Now, the Reconstruction Development Plan program, which was a program of the Government of National Unity, was closed by the ANC in 1996. It was just ceased to exist. And so we destroyed societal consensus. If you look at the local government, the number of times, even with someone with my access and reach and credibility, to just get water when a white farmer cuts off water to the village, there was no action. No action, no matter what we did. So what was the hands and feet of delivering the basic services of people? I can say generally across local government, and it's a fact, that 3/4 of the local governments don't do anything. It's a self-perpetuating bureaucracy. And usually in the poorest of areas, not in the richest of areas, because the rich people have a megaphone. So what do we need to do? We became bystanders in the development process. And then you created this little funnel of people like yourselves who study in universities like this and get a degree, that would be a beneficiary of that system. But the vast majority of graduates, as you know, black graduates, are walking the street. But so are graduates around the world. So, we're not unique in that anyway. So what is the developmental model of economic growth we need? And that's where we fail, because we've taken an orthodox approach that actually has been discarded everywhere in the world. And so we do not focus on the enabling environment that would take work that you are doing. And yesterday when I came here, I went past someone in Langa, running a place called Ikaya Ilanga. And it's strange. It's run by a person who, his parents came from Jamaica. He was born in London. And he ran Jamie Oliver's foundation And they were supposed to operate and set up a township-based, cafe, providing food and services for high quality. And eventually, Jamie changed his mind, but he came down. You know where he spent the last 10 years? In Langa. Name me one graduate that will go in Langa or in a township and build the township economy, because that's the goal of economic growth, creating assets in the hands of people that improve their lives and delivering the skills. He's built an incubator in an old abandoned school that was owned by the Catholic Church. And then they tried to take it away from him when he succeeded. And he still has to pay 11,000 rand rent a month to them. This is the Catholic Church, one of the richest organizations in the world, sabotaging someone who's not even South Africa, but doing more in the township than many black graduates that I know. And so the system conspires against people that want to do the right thing. And it's not conspired by just against by government and the bureaucracy, by all of us. So if you want to have an incubator analysis as a case study in this business school, then I'll recommend you go and visit him and try and understand how with nothing he's produced something that now supports 200 households around him. And people feel they're part of that community in the township. So until we get in the township and build assets, or get in the rural areas and build assets, or like in the conversation I tried to have with white farmers under Agri-SA, to say, if your wealth across the board over generations has been built by the contribution of your farm workers who stay in your farm, who have nothing, whose children are condemned to live in the poverty that you are because that's what your farm workers' wages are going to entitle you to, they've got no ability to even send them to a public school, then why can't you take 10% of your farm and ring fence it into something that is owned by those farm workers? What stops you supporting those farm workers becoming entrepreneurs in their own right? How many entrepreneurs have we given? Not the ones that are gifted by education or wherever they're coming from. What have we done for the person that has suffered the most in the past and continues to suffer today? What is your responsibility? And that's where business fails as much as government fails, because none of them did it. And so if one looks at it, it's a frustrating, painstaking process. Development is not easy. It's noisy, it's messy, and you can get your hands burnt. But if you have the courage to say we need a new societal consensus because the old consensus is dead today, then we should be sitting and having a real debate about what you bring to the table. Because there's a desperate need now. If you're an employer, you're a university professor, you're a business school, you're to the church or the faith-based organizations, what do you bring to the table? That's the conversation we need. I know what I can bring to the table, experience of what you should never do, you know? So I think that how do we make people active again, whether it's for political rights or economic rights, but hard work and discipline is what's going to get us there, and that's what's lacking in this country. And that's why we have a crisis of leadership. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, it's also a crisis global. So I think, yeah, I actually think the system should crash, because then we'll realize how much we lost because of our own ignorance and complicity. And that's when we begin to understand that we all one. We're all from one. And then we begin to see the other person. We begin to feel the other person. We begin to stop talking about Rainbow Nation and doing the real work to build it. And that means you've got to put something on the table. And unfortunately, those with power and those with affluence do not put anything on the table, generally. There are exceptions, but generally, every act of charity or CSI or other bullshit supply-side measures is about how can I get a contract somewhere? How can I improve my standing in the face of a corrupt leadership, wherever it is? And I think that's where we have dishonesty in our political debates in this country. And I Actually, I don't do much of these type of debates anymore.
Wow. I realize that my main job as a professor is to interrupt interesting conversations, and I am already getting the evil eye from the back of the room. What I'm going to do, because we promised that we would wrap this up, and so I don't want to hold people hostage who need to move on with their days, is to just offer a minute to each of the other panelists to add to that conversation, and then maybe some of us can stick around and have a more informal conversation for a little bit. So I want us to pick up on that point of what should we be doing, right? If we accept that the current system is broken, and Jay has suggested maybe even needs to crash, but we don't want to see it burn. We don't want to see the country burn. What do we each need to be doing as South Africans, as business leaders, as civil society leaders, as academic leaders, to push things in the right direction?
Two things that I would say is a priority. The one is, and Tsechu, I'm very happy to say I'm also from the Northwest Province, and I'm immensely proud of what I heard from you. I think we met before, anyway. I think in SRC circles and in NGOs it would be called we have agency. I think one of the problems we have, and Jay referred to that the state wanted to do everything. We shouldn't be dependent on the state as much as we are. Now I know for some things like passport, an ID document, you are dependent on the state. But for many other things, you don't need to be dependent. I'm not talking about rich people, I'm talking about ordinary people. So my first point would be, use your agency and start thinking about what you can contribute, even as a student. If not now, then next year or the year after. We are too caught up as a nation in being the victim of forces, the victim of state capture, the victim of this, the victim of that, the victim of the past. I think we should get out of that, and we should say, I've got agency, what can I do? And if I can get along without the state, great, because this won't change easily. I mean, even if we have a change in government in 2029, it'll take 5 to 10 years to get the civil service right, because you can't fire people. And the corrupt guys will stay because they have a professional career in politics. So that's the first point. Secondly, how much as Brian would like us to have this discussion about economic policy and bureaucracy and systems, I think the first priority for South Africans is to get the governance right. And therefore, whoever you vote for, if you're not registered, the SRC should run a campaign for young people to get registered, to go and vote and change the system. Now, I know people say, I can't change the system, but I think we all have a responsibility to say, I cannot feign indifference. I cannot say, and I'm not saying who you should vote for. You can look at all those. I personally hope that there's a coalition on the opposition side can get their bloody act together, because at the moment they don't seem to get their act together. But go and vote. Register and go and vote, and urge other people to go and vote, because was it 10 million South Africans who were eligible, didn't even register. And unless we get governance right, we won't get the economy right. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have 2 points that actually I draw from the discussions that my colleagues have made. So one is the involvement of the private sector, like for the business sector to thrive. And the minute we realize the role of other institutions, I include the academics, I include the business sector, I include the non-state actors, is when we will be able to move forward as a country. And even in terms of the points I made before of education and health, the involvement of the private sector is critical in terms of linking, diluting the involvement of the government too much, and also providing some of the services themselves. And that will also enhance inclusivity in the inclusiveness of the population and the poor at large. So it's quite important to understand the role of each of us in terms of economic development, inclusiveness, and job creation. He talked about for us to move away from issues of expecting job creation, we should also involve ourselves with what is actually happening. We have digital technologies that can also create jobs. We have digital technologies that can improve productivity without necessarily to employ more people. We can also build skills, which we call learning by doing, not necessarily going through formal education. These are some of the issues that we also need to also integrate into our day-to-day way of doing business. I think these are my points for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last words.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, we should stop complaining and start getting our hands dirty. And I think, we tend to make excuses, whether we blame politics or political parties, and also with, our orphans, whenever someone tries to come up with an excuse, oh, I can't do this because I'm like, I can give myself as an example. I lost my parents when I was 14, and I know that I had the backing of people that expected so much from me, right? And I had to work really hard. Getting into the London School of Economics, I didn't get there because of BEE or because I'm like I had to work my back off. So we also need to stop complaining. If you love South Africa, you need to do something about it. Complaining is not going to help. So that's number one. Number two, I come across amazing entrepreneurs. I love working in rural areas because there's so much innovation, like it's life-giving for me. And I think it's easy for our entrepreneurs to get discouraged because they're not part of a political party, therefore they're not going to get funding. These are the realities, guys. Like, this is what's happening. And I'm sad because sometimes it just kills the spirit, the entrepreneurship spirit out of a young person. They just give up. They fall into this vicious cycle. I would like our young entrepreneurs, even students, to start looking outwardly for opportunities. On the other side, especially in terms of like export, there's so many opportunities for us to be able to provide solutions to the global market as well, right? So we need to stop looking not only inwardly, but we need to be outwardly looking, right? Especially for economies of scale, right? In terms of like providing certain products, like in my industry with wine, it's hard to find South African wine represented in many countries, right? So my goal is we're gonna move wines, and then we need to move volumes, right? And we need to be able to tell our stories in the wine industry, right? And so I encourage young people to look at, opportunities in export, because Africa, when I go outside, between February and March, I was in Europe and the US, and people are excited about Africa, people are excited about South Africa, they want to hear about the news stories coming out of South Africa, they want to hear more about businesses coming out of South Africa. So I know it's easy to get discouraged, but there's so much on the other end. I'm not saying leave, build for export, so yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's grab just a couple more. I think the gentleman behind you has been patient, and then.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. My name is Wade Davidson. So my question, I think, will be, can I call Jay? Can I call you on the first name? Sorry, James or Prof. Tiens or Tiens. You talked a lot about the reconstruction and development plan, and I remember that. But wasn't that followed up with the National Development Plan that nobody talks about anymore? And I think it was, the latest one is NDP 2030. That plans, that main aims was to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality by 2030. But nobody's talking about that. And so my question is that still a living or working document in process, or what is happening with that? Who's driving that?
Let's grab a couple more questions before we open back up. And again, anybody who needs to, okay.
So I have a question for Ms. Mamelo. Is it okay if I call you that? My question is, you mentioned reasons as to why South Africa's economy is weak. So I just wanted to know that could it be possible that another reason that would contribute to South Africa's weak economy and the rest of the continent as a collective would be its inability to trade with African countries, to basically prioritize trading with African countries? Because when we look at our society, we live in a society that is very much, it focuses on the importance of alignment with countries outside of Africa. If you look at BRICS, for example. I just wanted to know what would this internal trading of the African continent do to better the economy? And basically, could that also, like this inability, does it actually contribute to South Africa's weak economy?
Okay, and I think we're going to grab a couple of questions online. Can you be our reporter for those?
And Grow on the Go wants to know, what do you believe are the 3 priority levers that could mobilize economic transformation?
And then another question?
The other one was a comment. I'll read it later.
Hi everyone, my name is Kanti and I'm doing my 3rd year in international studies. I have 2 or 3 questions. Number one.
Just one, please.
Oh.
Just prioritize.
Okay. Okay, I will embed in, right? So can economic freedom come at the cost of political freedom? Because the way the state was created, looking at like the history of South Africa in general, like after apartheid, the state's main role was just to empower the black community and in that essence also be the source of provision of everything, right? And I think that leads to the corruption that we see, right? So in bringing accountability, it's something that I've always thought of, and I don't know if it's possible. Should we allow the opposition parties to be liable for or accountable for the ruling parties' inactivities? Like they should be, instead of independent systems which are not clearly independent as we put them, rather put like your opposition parties to be liable and the ones doing the investigations in a way that is not rigged, if that makes sense. I don't know if that is like...
So,
I have 2 more, but I think we should answer.
Yeah, no, and what I'd like to just ask the panelists to jump in on is, we know as South Africans and Africans that there are so many opportunities, and we've heard some of them here. If we actually implemented the plans that we wrote, if we looked at our African neighbors and the possibilities of trade, if we treated accountability in government as something to be taken seriously, we could imagine positive things happening. And yet we're having trouble mobilizing, and I think that goes to the online question, we're having trouble mobilizing, right? Lusego's call to action, we all kind of sat up and said, yeah, I want to get to work. And Dr. Elof as well, is if I love my country, I better get out there. And how do we make that happen? How do you think about catalyzing a broader coalition for the South Africa that so many of us care about and hope for and still believe in? Anybody wants to look? That one's so big, I don't know what we're going to do with it.
Let me then start, say, on the RDP and the NDP and everything in between. Implementation, execution, didn't happen. And it became increasingly more difficult as the Zuma years put things into corruption, because you don't want to do a good program if you can't get money from it. You can't milk a tender. And I also think we had too many. At some point, I had a
I'm going to interrupt you.
10 policies in 13 years.
No, I'm going to interrupt you. That's true. What are we going to do about it?
He's asked that question. I'm
No,
answering
I know.
him
I'm
now.
just
Okay.
I'm reframing a little bit.
I
We've
would
gotta
say
keep focused
I would
on-
say we need a new civil society movement consisting of, as we did in the peace process, and it's not exactly the same because we're different, consisting of religious organizations, faith-based communities, the unions, business, big and small, and who did I leave out? And churches, NGOs, and broader civil society, to keep politicians of all parties accountable. So if we can start a movement like we did, Jay, and say we are not for any party, we are for the following values, and we will do our best to keep political parties accountable. If they stray from that, we'll tell our members don't vote for them anymore. Or if they stray from that, I oversimplify. But I mean, I think that's what we need, because we agree on more things than we disagree on. I always say to white audiences, if we had, you are 50, if we had 50 black South Africans here and we asked them, what do you want? It'll be the same things. Exactly the same things. And so I think we need that, but it will be difficult in a polarized political atmosphere to do it, but I don't think it's impossible.
Thank you. So I would add to what he's saying in that I think there are a lot of opportunities for South Africa, just like any African country, to actually engage in intra-Africa trade. There are so many trading agreements. We have the recent African Continental Free Trade Area. There are so many that have been there before. But what is the issue? What is it that is preventing South Africa from taking advantage of these opportunities? I think the first thing that I would say is building linkages within South Africa between the small and large firms, right? Because small businesses are stagnant, they are not able to grow, and they cannot expand to export because of the constraint they are facing as small businesses. Only large firms, even evidence shows that only a small share of large firms is able to export and take advantage of these opportunities that the region has presented for South Africa as a country. Now, how do we help the small businesses to grow and to be able to expand to export? Building linkages, that's one. Number two is finance. I think he has already talked about that. Access to finance is a significant constraint to small businesses. And if that could be provided for these businesses, they could be able to expand. And also the issues of technologies. How do you advertise your business? How do you make your business to be present in the regional, at the regional level? Information. I think one of the things that I like about the African Continental Free Trade Area is that it has a segment where it wants to build small businesses in different countries to be able to thrive and be able to take advantage of the markets. So I think that's basically a key point here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I would add exposure as well for our entrepreneurs, because I think things like, lack of access to information can really hold them back from, participating in trade opportunities. I was just in Nigeria yesterday, and it's just amazing to me that even in an economy like Nigeria, they still, they are still struggling, in terms of like certain products that we have in South Africa or solutions that our entrepreneurs can provide, right? So I think basic things like making sure that there's connectivity, broadband connectivity in our rural areas. And I find that a lot of our entrepreneurs miss out on opportunities because they don't have a business plan, and how do you expect those people to have business plans, They can't register online for CEDA programs because they're far out in the Kalahari, and that's where some of our programs are. So these are the realities. It's not that people are lazy. So how do we make sure that we increase access to information, and also we expose our entrepreneurs to opportunities for them to begin to trade with the world?
I want to thank thank you all for honoring the question, because everything you talk to is something that somebody could go home and start doing today. I could help increase linkages. I could help increase finance. I could reach out of my comfort zone if I'm a business person to a church leader, if I'm a church leader to another part of civil society. So I want to really thank you all for honoring the intent of the question to say, what can we do? Jay, I'm going to end with you. We started with youth with the questions. We're going to leave it to the elder to close us. What I most appreciated about your book on change was that you started by making fun of yourself about how bad you were at organizing when you got started. So everything we've talked about today requires us to organize and to mobilize. For some of us are novices in thinking about that way of organizing and mobilizing. What's the one thing you want us to take away as people who aspire to organize, to mobilize, and to bring about these changes?
You know, organizing is an art and a science. And it's the art of coalition building. And the one lesson I learned in life is that we built monolithic organizations. COSATU, the ANC, the UDF. And those were great because they were fit for purpose, and the idea was to challenge a authoritarian regime with racist policies. And we did. And we created a stalemate within which a negotiation between equal partners could take place. And that's the reason why we organize. You know, it's a goal is to get to a point where the person sitting on the other side of the table respects you as a human being, irrespective of color, your race, your status in society. So the difference, I would say today, given what I've learned, is that these organizations and institutions we create ultimately become institutionalized, bureaucratized, and dependent on a very powerful authority and leadership. And that can be a good thing when you're going through very fragile times, and you know, akin to that of a civil war. You need strong leadership, strong organization. You need this mothership. I think that's not fit for purpose today. And that what we do need is each individual, and there's 60 million of us, and we are spread across the spectrum of society, in every level of the society, across everything that is done in this country. And if each one of us could do just one thing. You know, sometimes it's actually when you're getting at a robot and the guy wants to wash your window and you're irritated and you scream at him and bang your hooter. Why don't you roll down the window and ask, what is your name? Where do you come from? Engage the person. Because something made that person give up on life. And you got to see that person for who they are, the pure person, beyond the discrepantness and the anger and the state of addiction that person is. It's a human being. And I see you. And I feel your pain. Feel the pain. Because that pain is the great teacher for all of us of what you can be in any lifetime, in the past or in the future. So recognize yourself in the face of those that we do not see today. And let me tell you, we do not see the vast majority of people that go through our lives, that work in our gardens, that work in our homes, that take care of our children. We don't see them. And so they're invisible. Make that visible. So yesterday was May Day. How many farms were still working, with workers working on them? Are you questioning that? Many of the people attending this university not just come like my sister here, from townships or whatever. They come from privileged homes. I've been there because last week I was in Bochendal, meeting with 60 young people who many had not even ever been to a wine estate. So when you are in the wine estate, are you the worker, the farm worker? So what are you going to do about the children of that farm worker? And I think that for me is that we're building something where each one of us is an organization with agency, with voice, with a microphone, with some access to some resources. And that's where we've got to find the Madiba magic, that I feel something. And therefore I'm compelled and obliged to do something. And if we can all do that, we're building not a mothership that will take us into the bush again. We're building an armada of small boats that will lift the tide of our country. That's what we need today. It should become an organism rather than an organization. An organism that is like a mycelium that spreads like the roots of a trunk of a tree and feeds each other. Until we as South Africans do that, the wound that we have, whether it's a wound of superiority or inferiority, will continue to fester. And sometimes a comment on a social media explodes it. Or sometimes a stupid incident, like you had many stupid incidents on this university, could ignite something which takes us back to the time of the 80s that we first introduced. Yes. We don't want to go there. And as an elder, I'm warning you all not to go there. So in constructing the future, be as militant as you want, but understand everything we are doing, whether it's protest, it's writing, it's sitting here, is to get us to a point where we see each other and we share each other's pain and we agree to cast something into the future that says we're in one boat and we have potential of losing everything if we act in the stupidity and greed that we had of the past. That's my advice.
Thank you. I think that's as good a place as we're ever going to have to press the pause button. Mark, I'm going to give you the unenviable task of wrapping us up here today.
Thank you very much. And the words I was going to start with. I have both the challenge and the privilege to wrap up your experiences. And thank you to the people who joined us online, but also in the room. I think if I was to wrap up with a few thoughts, I would say maybe 2 or 3 things. And once South Africa has big challenges, and there are no easy answers. So I apologize for anybody who thought we were going to come away with easy answers today, because there are none. And the panelists have really captured that. But there are no easy answers anywhere in the world. I go to conferences where people say, oh, if only we could have the German training system, we would fix all our problems. But they're saying that all around the world. If we only have huge challenges in making those changes come through. I think it's important, if I can, to say, to recognize where South Africa has come from. 30 years ago, South Africa was on a knife edge. I was in the UK watching, and we also expected a racial civil war. And that didn't happen. And I think for that, we should be grateful, but also say, well, that's a source of hope and a sign that things can change and change in a positive way. The other thing I'm positive about and optimistic about, and this might sound strange as an Englishman, is I'm positive and optimistic about the possibility for South-North learning. There's a lot of things we do here in South Africa that we can experiment and demonstrate to the world that knowledge can be generated and created, and solutions here in the South. Whether that's our responses to climate change, perhaps hopeful responses to inequality, but also all the other challenges that the world faces. They don't have to come from the North, and they will only come from South Africa for South Africa. And the small examples like Jay Naidu mentioned for Langer, we have those in the business school where we're very active with the Small Business Academy, creating the economy at the ground. But what we've seen today finally says we underline the need for change, the need for us to come together as civil society, as all actors in society, to not to be bystanders, and all of us in our own way, to make small differences. to be leaders in our own way and hold our own leaders to account for their accountability. And I think Stellenbosch, given its history, given its economic power, given its wealth, needs to be part of that and cannot be a bystander in itself. So finally to say that change is clearly coming. Change has to come because this is not a sustainable situation. Stellenbosch Business School won't be a bystander. We're committed to our role as a convening space for that. Our role is to educate the future leaders, but also to create a space where we can perhaps find solutions at all levels of society. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to the panel.
Go and have a cup of tea.